Hello everybody. Here is another story. This one is about an old car, a vintage car called Gumdrop. And we particularly like these stories about Gumdrop because the author Val Biro used to live in Bosham near Chichester. And so the pictures in the book show the area around there, the harbour and the houses and the church. So I hope you enjoy it too. So this one is Gumdrop at Sea. Now we need to establish who are the most important people and things in this story. The first one is Gumdrop. Then we have the Bumblebee family, Gumdrop's engine, Horace the dog, Mr. Oldcastle who owns Gumdrop, the fisherman and the old fishing boat. One sunny summer's day, the road to the sea was jammed with traffic. Beep, beep, went the horns, and toodle-doo. People were getting impatient because something was holding them up. Honk, honk, went another horn. It belonged to a very special car, an Austin Clifton Heavy 12.4 vintage 1926. And there is, of course, only one car with a horn like that. His name is Gumdrop. Mr. Josiah Oldcastle sat at the wheel and honked again. He was getting impatient too, and so was his dog Horace. He went woof, woof. And do you know who was holding up the traffic? Well, it was the Bumblebee family. The car had broken down, as it frequently did, and they didn't know what to do. "The car won't go," complained Mr. Bumblebee. "Our holiday is ruined," wailed Mrs. Bumblebee. The Bumblebee children just moaned and demanded ice cream. "Let me help you," said Mr. Oldcastle. He had recognised his neighbours, and he brought Gumdrop up to give them a tow to a garage. So they hitched the battered car to Gumdrop, while Mrs. Bumblebee directed the traffic with her parasol. As they drove to a nearby garage, Gumdrop struggled under the heavy load. His engine went brum, clang, brum, brum, clang. Mr. Oldcastle didn't like those clangs. "It's probably your big end going," said the garage man. "Not surprising, really, in an old car like this." Mr. Oldcastle didn't like the sound of that at all, but they wanted to get to the sea in time. So the Bumblebees left their car for repairs and squeezed into Gumdrop to continue their journey to the sea. Gumdrop had to climb a steep hill on the way, and as he did so, his engine went brum, clangety clang, brum, brum. The Bumblebees were really too heavy for the old car. "Your big end's going," said Mr. Bumblebee. "How frightful!" cried Mrs. Bee. "We want ice cream," wailed the children. "Woof, woof," went Horace. Mr. Oldcastle said nothing, because he didn't like those clangety clangs one little bit. At long last, there was the harbour, and everybody cheered up. Even Gumdrop sounded happy. Brum, brum, went his engine, as if nothing had happened. He was a reliable old car, and he'd brought his heavy load safely to the sea. But just as they parked on the shore, Gumdrop's engine made the most terrible noises. It clanged and clattered as if it were ready to explode. And then, in a cloud of smoke, with a final mighty bang, it stopped. "Oh, my goodness!" exclaimed Mr. Oldcastle as he looked under the bonnet. "The engine's blown up!" There was oil everywhere, and a great big hole in the crankcase. "Oh dear," said Mr. Bumblebee. "Your big end's gone all right." and that big hole can't be repaired either. Mr. Oldcastle knew that only too well. Gumdrop would need a new engine now. But where would he find another 1926 Austin 12.4 engine? He might have to search around for years. For the moment, though, there was nothing to be done, and as the bumblebees were impatient to go for a sail, Mr. Oldcastle decided to go with them. Poor old Gumdrop was left standing on the shore. They hired an old fishing boat. "All aboard," called Mr. Bumblebee, who was the captain now. "Hoist the sails, anchors away." And they sailed out into deep waters with many a "Jibo" and "Ready about." Mrs. B lay back to sunbathe under her parasol. The children ate ice cream and Horace tried to fish. Everybody was happy, except Mr. Oldcastle, who was thinking about Gumdrop's broken engine. The tide was flowing, and a strong wind blew up. Mr. Bumblebee got out his telescope and scanned the horizon. Then he turned his gaze towards the shore. "Look, the water is nearly up to Gumdrop." Mr. Oldcastle was much alarmed. "We must turn back at once," he cried, "or Gumdrop will be washed out to sea." But just at that moment Horace saw a fish. He grabbed at it, but unfortunately he lost his balance and splash! He fell straight into the water. Mr. Oldcastle was dismayed, as if he hadn't have enough worries already. But he didn't hesitate. He plunged into the waters there and then to rescue his dog. Mr. Bumblebee leant over the side to help, and the others grabbed Horace to pull him on board. Unfortunately, all this extra weight tilted the boat so much that, with a great big splash, the bumblebees fell into the water as well. "Mayday! Mayday!" boomed Mr. Bumblebee. "Help! Help!" gurgled Mrs. B. "Ice cream! Ice cream!" spluttered the children. And Mr. Oldcastle saw their boat floating away with the tide. But soon enough some boats sailed up to rescue them. Everybody was hauled on board, and it was then that Mr. Oldcastle remembered Gumdrop. "Hurry, hurry," he cried, "or my car will be washed out to sea." When they reached the shore, the water was already up to Gumdrop's mudguards. There was no time to lose. "Shoulders to the wheel," commanded Mr. B, and everybody strained and heaved and pulled and pushed until Gumdrop was safely back on dry land at last. It was then that Mr. Oldcastle remembered Horace. "My dog! Where's my dog?" he cried in anguish. But Horace was nowhere to be seen. Poor Mr. Oldcastle. First his car blew up, then it was nearly washed out to sea while he was almost drowned himself, and now his dog was missing. What a day of disasters! As he looked round, he saw that their own fishing boat had floated in on the tide and stopped in front of Gumdrop. Once more he heard a sort of muffled bark. "Whoomp! Whoomp!" Mr. Oldcastle leapt on board. The sound came from under the engine cover. He tore it off, and there was Horace sitting by the engine, safe and sound. He folded the dog in his arms and felt happy for the first time that day. Then he looked at the boat's engine. It was old. It was big. It was beautiful. And it was exactly like Gumdrop's. Why, it's a genuine 1926 Austin 12.4 engine, and not a crack or a hole anywhere. Mr. Oldcastle could hardly believe his good luck. Good old Horace had found the perfect engine for Gumdrop. Mr. Oldcastle danced around so joyfully that Horace got quite dizzy in his arms. The fisherman who owned the old boat was quite happy to sell the engine. "It came out of an old car, just like yours," he said. "Anyway, I'd just as soon have a modern diesel for my boat." So all was well in the end. Mr. Oldcastle took the precious engine to be overhauled and then joined the bumblebees on their holiday. He bought ice creams for the children every day, and Horace caught as much fish as he wanted. Best of all, Gumdrop has a sparkling new engine now, and he is running better than ever. What's more, Mr. Oldcastle is determined to keep his car firmly on dry land from now on. Brum brum. One last thing. If you ever go down to the harbour, look out for that old fishing boat. Believe it or not, you will find that it's called Gumdrop too. The end. Hope you enjoyed that. Bye.